In this presentation, we will, with textual examples, suggest how the role, values and perceptions of knights in literature are changed through the ages and how some fundamental features and virtues of the knight have stayed true to the original template of valour and faith. A text that sets out knight's virtues and his chivalric code is the epic poem The Song of Roland. The poem presents us with the early perception of what a knight is, acting with honour, valour and faith. The poem describes the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass in 778 during the reign of Charlemagne. The text is what's known as a chanson de geste, which is Old French for song of heroic deeds. The epic poem shows through Roland's example the knightly virtues and code of conduct that all knights should maintain, depicting a battle between good, which are the Franks, and the evil, which are the Saracens, with religion and faith serving as the driving force between the two sides in the holy war that is being fought. It introduces the theme present in classic knightly stories of devotion to the Christian faith. During the battle, Roland dies a martyr's death after being betrayed, and his spirit is taken to heaven by angels from the battlefield, representing the ultimate form of loyalty through self-sacrifice for his liege and faith in God. Themes of duty and honour are heavily prevalent throughout the poem, and Roland's example embodies the template for knightly virtues. These values that Roland portrays are then later listed by the Duke of Burgundy with documentation of the 12 chivalric virtues during the 14th century for the Order of the Golden Fleece. The group of noblemen was formed to promote God and defend the Christian faith, with the group's control spreading through Europe. Many knights swore allegiance to the group and vowed to uphold the virtues set out by Burgundy. These virtues are easily identifiable in medieval literature and beyond, describing the knight's way of life and the perfect hero. Due to the virtues set out for knights, they classically tend to appear in early literature in the Romance genre, due to its themes of chivalric acts with the quest that they partake in, allowing their characters to show their nobility. Knights in these romances always demonstrate their noble abilities, separating them from the lower classes and highlighting themselves as superiors in their acts of valour and virtue.
The legend of King Arthur and the Round Table can be traced all the way back to the 9th century, supposedly by the author Nennius, and then later in the 11th century by Geoffrey of Monmouth, among various other writers. It was presented as a historical text, yet bore no factual basis. The legend blossomed shortly after the Battle of Hastings, not only in Celtic England, but in the north of France as well. This merging of two worlds and separate stories proved fundamental in the transition point of a genre, turning it from a political fable to how we know it as today, a tale of chivalric romance and mystical quest. Arthur and his knights briefly died out but were revived by Henry VIII, and then later the Victorian period. This age of Arthur was a time of nostalgia. Considering the immense scientific and literary advancements, people looked back at this as the golden age, never again achievable, and thus making it all the more poignant. Galahad was one of the most famous knights. He embodied everything that was deemed characteristic of a classic knight, including chivalry and boldness. Indeed, so perfect a knight was he that King Arthur himself deemed Galahad to be the greatest knight in the world. As one of the most esteemed knights, Galahad was the only one to take the seat of Sage Perilous on the Round Table successfully. This indicated that he would be the knight to rescue the Holy Grail, one of the most dangerous yet revered quests of all time. Along with this, another prevalent story of Galahad is him pulling a sword from a stone that was inscribed with how only the greatest knight could release it. This draws direct parallels with Arthur, making Galahad all the more esteemed, which could explain why he was so popular. Like many other knights, he showed no signs of weaknesses, nearly perfect. He maintains a chivalric status throughout, completed perilous quests, and always remains fearless. Contextually, his character was also a devout Christian, a popular characteristic of this time, making him all the more popular to the reader. Sir Lancelot is perhaps the most well-known knight in Arthurian literature. His character did not appear until the late 1100s. Lancelot is the king's champion and is portrayed as a skilled armsman. He was initially known for his chivalric nature. However, the plot of him rescuing Guinevere and subsequently taking her as his lover could contrast this. This theme within all Arthurian stories was highly unusual, as before his knights were unattainably perfect. No flaws, only humble and bold. Although Lancelot also embodied these traits, his lack of chivalrousness displayed him to be more human. He had flaws much like the reader did, and the fact it was of love made him all the more relatable to the reader. Another relatable aspect to his character is the failure of finding the Holy Grail. Before this, all knights in literature had successfully completed their trials. Lancelot's failure further humanised him, giving him more appeal.
Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a poem written in the mid to late 14th century based on the character of Sir Gawain from Arthurian legend. The character is described as a traditional romantic hero and is one of the more well-known characters of British mythology. It follows his quest to complete a challenge set by the Green Knight. After beheading the Green Knight, Gawain must receive a strike of equal measure back from the Green Knight in a year and a day. Even though he knows he would probably die at the end of this quest, Gawain still sets out to complete his challenge, emphasising his fearless character, which was common for a knight. During the quest, he is tested in a series of games to prove himself in accordance to the Code of Chivalry. Sir Gawain follows this Code of Chivalry by showing his knightly virtues through his compromise with Lady Bertilac, since it is divided between his honour and his courtly duty. The poem explores themes throughout such as chivalry, friendship, generosity, chastity and piety, which every character in the poem adheres to. In contrast, Don Quixote is considered to be the first modern novel and is a satire on the pre-existing romance genre. Written in two parts, 1605 and 1615, Don Quixote tells the story of Alonso Quixano, who is a 50-year-old minor nobleman who has read so many books on chivalry he's lost his wits and decides to roam the Spanish countryside as a knight-errant with a peasant, Sancho Panza, he hires to be his squire. He also names himself Don Quixote and claims that all his chivalric deeds are done for his love of Dulcinea, a peasant woman he randomly picks out as his lady and who has no clue he's doing this. During his quest, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza encounter several misadventures along the way, including a battle against 30 or more monstrous windmills. Cervantes uses all of the hallmarks of traditional romance cliches like quests, knights, battles, fair maidens and chivalric deeds, which would normally be taken seriously to emphasise the ridiculousness of the genre.
Characters that are explicitly stated to be knights appear to be missing within literature for some time. Knights began to die out in Europe around the time that gunpowder and firearms were introduced into warfare between the 13th and 15th century. It became unnecessary to arm a country with knights when better weapons were available as a stronger defence and they required far less training. Due to the lack of status that now surrounded these warriors, they became less of a hero to look up to and simply a part of the social hierarchy. The end of the feudal system also saw the downfall of the traditional knight, as the title became more of a social one. Because the knight was typically a heavily Christian figure, it became an issue when the two forms of Christianity in England, Catholicism and Protestantism, clashed, and the religious Reformation started. People were stripped and awarded knighthood based on the religion they followed, depending on the monarchs on the throne. Chivalry supposedly offers purpose and meaning to male strength. While knights were no longer the heroes of the story, characters who held these traits were viewed as good. Looking into Shakespeare's comedies, characters like Lysander and Theseus from A Midsummer Night's Dream are viewed as good characters because they hold the values of chivalry, while the character of Aegeus, who is arguably the villain within the play, doesn't follow the chivalric code, suggesting that while there were no explicit knights in these texts that were to be viewed as heroes, the qualities that made knights remained. While the character of the knight appears to be lacking in literature for quite some time, the rebirth of the knight appears in modern adaptations like Game of Thrones and the BBC series Merlin, but the traditional character of the knight, one who follows the chivalric code, is missing unless looking at very obvious texts.
There is a contrast between Ishiguro's portrayal of Gawain in The Buried Giant and the original texts. His loyalty to King Arthur poses as a more antagonistic trait, as it remains ambiguous as to whether he will help Axel and Beatrice, the protagonists, on their journey if their needs clash with his. Furthermore, the symbolism of the mist in the novel correlates with the idea that the loyalty of knights is perhaps antagonistic, thereby demonising the character tropes of the knight. Axel's memories of being a knight, as well as the treatment of his wife, are better off buried, and Gawain's sporadic memories of his days serving King Arthur lead to his demise as he fights Winston to protect the she-dragon he promised to protect. Ishiguro conveys this key quality of knights as somewhat foolish. He raises the question of whether unwavering loyalty to a monarch is truly a good thing, and that perhaps all it brings out is inevitable conflict. In this case, the conflict being the clash of Britain and Saxon cultures and their respective faiths, which ties in with the original knightly value of abiding faith. Like Ishiguro, Martin creates knights from an alternative perspective. His characters are more varied than the knights of classical literature. This is most likely due to books being available to far more people in the 21st century than medieval England. There's both leeway and expectation for characters to be more complex in order to be enjoyed by a larger demographic. One of Martin's knights is Sir Jaime Lannister, who is something of an anti-hero. Although committing despicable acts such as attempted child murder and entering and maintaining an incestuous relationship with his sister, Jamie also ignored his loyalty to the king and killed him when he felt he was becoming a threat to the kingdom and its people, at the cost of his own status and respect amongst royalty. Therefore, he demonstrates the values of a knight, such as bravery and selflessness. There is also a female character, Brienne of Tarth, who demonstrates the values of a knight, which would not have been seen in classical literature.